Everyone, and thank you for joining the Risk Call. Today we have David Moon and Andrew Patterson from Marks Nimbus and John Merchant from Falcon Risk Services. If you have any questions during the call, you can use the Q&A section on the right.
Great. Thank you, Tara. And thanks everyone for joining. Really excited about today's discussion. As we all know, today's world is very complex and challenging for those trying to either advise, such as the brokers, or those on the front lines of managing these cyber risks for the organization. The current threats that we're facing today are not just complex, but they're rapidly evolving with dramatic technological advancement and clear geopolitical rise of geopolitical tensions. So the financial and human elements and implications are real. And while in our work, we work with organizations to look at appropriately identifying, managing, and remediating their risks, one often sometimes overlooked, but also top of mind topic is how do we develop optimal strategies for appropriate risk transfer? And of course, commercial insurance plays a critical role in helping organizations defend and prepare themselves for, the if not when scenario that we all dread. And while nearly all cybersecurity professionals know and will acknowledge that this is obviously needed, what we see in our own analysis, and David will get into it, and I know John is eager to discuss it as well. We see a chronic underinsurance throughout all industries, regardless of size of the organization. And we can look at recent, not just our own data that again David will get into, but we look at recent headlines that kind of point to this truth and reality. So whether that's Change Healthcare, whether that's Equifax, et cetera, these folks are only transferring mere percentage points of their total risk exposure. And so on today's call, we'll really dive into why we think that is, how we can address that, and more appropriately balance an optimal cyber risk transfer strategy to true risk exposure, which is often lacking. And so, David, I'd kick it off to you, and really looking forward, John, thank you for joining, and looking forward to your input during this important discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, John, for being here on the call as well. I think this is a very, very important topic for a lot of the reasons you mentioned, Andrew. And it is one area, and I say this as a practicing CISO myself and CISSP, that it's one area that is very thinly understood, if we want to use that phrase, because time and again, we come out and we speak to various groups. We were just in Raleigh with the ISACA chapter there, and the number one thing they wanted to ask about was cyber insurance. How should they be thinking about it? How do you really get a cyber insurance program dialed in properly so that it's really an effective part of your cybersecurity protections? And it's amazing the level of lack of understanding of all of this out there. So I think today's sort of one take at an educational effort, if you will, as well, around let's shine a spotlight on this area of cyber insurance, get some understanding out there of it. And I think it's fair to say every company is treating it in almost a completely different way in many respects. So anyway, over to you, John.
Sure. Thank you, David and Andrew, and just Arcs Nimbus in general for inviting me to this. And just by way of background, folks, I've been in the cyber insurance industry for a little over 20 years now. And Falcon Risk Services is a majority-owned MGA of a company called HDI, which is a major European global insurer, and I've been in the cyber market for a long time. So I've seen the market mature from a very small market in 2004 and 5, which was roughly $250 million market. And now globally, it is in the billions, very, very large market, and expected to grow by 23 to 25% compound over the next several years. So it's a very big market. However, to David's point, the issue we're talking about here in the chronic under insurance, or in some cases, complete lack of insurance for cyber, is something that, if solved for through education mainly, will make the market much, much bigger. And just in comparison, the property market is scores bigger than the cyber market is. However, you'd have a hard time finding any executive to tell you that their network and their operations are unimportant and they don't need to insure them, and therefore that's why they don't bother buying cyber insurance. So it's an interesting conversation to have, to say the least. And seeing the market mature over the past 20 years, you'd think that most companies would by now have recognized the value of their data, the value of their intangible assets. And many do, but again, many don't. And I think the intangible aspect of that is a big reason why we have this underinsurance issue.
Yeah, no question. And we were just kind of starting to talk about this, but we have one of our board members actually authored the $400 million charge against earnings at Sony Pictures when he was chief accounting officer there. And we were talking about it on a board meeting just last Friday. And, you know, you look at the components that go into this, 400 million was kind of a breathtaking number at that point. But now, of course, we have, and part of the question is, are we becoming numb to some of these things? Part of certainly the media is. So now we have the Equifax loss that happened some 5 or 6 years ago. We also have the more recent Change Healthcare loss as part of United Healthcare. So now you went from 400 million, which was a shocking number. And if you can remember back, some of us have been in the career field that long that we can remember the Home Depot loss. That was a shocker at the time. And then Target, which even exceeded the Home Depot loss. And so Sony was in there somewhere at 400 million. Now you end up with Equifax at 1.4 billion. And it's totally swamped now and eclipsed by the loss at United Healthcare of what looks like it's trending towards around 6.5 according to industry analysts. So, you know, this is a vast ratcheting up, and I doubt if the top loss in terms of property and casualty has marched up in that kind of progression. And so we're really in, you know, if you look at what goes into these losses, by the way, it's worth mentioning that you've got, you know, obviously the loss itself, you've got fines, fees, sanctions that the organization may have to pay to regulators. And you also have, however, the notification cost. And so that is not immaterial. And we can focus on that here in a bit, but because companies tend to not understand that at a very fundamental level. And this is part of where this thing goes off the rails. Then you have PR expense, you've got equity losses. What happened in the case of Equifax, actually, and we've got trading data from the first 3 to 5 days after the incident was announced, is about a $5 billion loss in market cap. And so that's very material. Now, of course, since then, they've, quote, recovered that. Did they recover to a level that was similar to what they would have been without the loss? They kind of went through this trough in terms of equity value. And so how you account for that is kind of something that accountants continue to try to adapt to. But, you know, then you have the public announcements that have to go out. And now SEC has everyone on a much tighter leash in terms of time frame of those announcements. So you have a lot of costs in this. I think Equifax, there were somewhere around 23 class action suits that were filed shortly after the loss went public. And so those have to wind their way there. I mean, it's just tremendous amount of expenses. And it is a fairly unpredictable ride for these companies who've been through a major incident. And so now you have, you know, you could say all day long before the incident happens, what's the probability? Well, once it happens, it's a 1.0 probability, folks.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer a mystery. You know what losses you, but by then it's too late. You can't go back to your insurer and say, look, let's recalibrate here. So our objective, partly with the message that we're kicking off here today, is know your risk exposure. Don't go into this blind. Have an understanding of, at least, is it bigger than a bread box, so to speak, And people do this all the time. They do this in property and casualty. They survey what are the auditors come in. They do a physical count of the inventory that's in the warehouse. What is the warehouse made of in terms of materials? What kind of replacement cost would it have? What would be the loss of the goods in the warehouse? And the time that it takes to rebuild that capacity operationally for the organization as well. So, and people have a reasonable idea of that. But when it comes to cyber, it's all over the place.
That's a good point. John, it goes back to. I'm sorry, Andrew. Go ahead.
What is your thought on that? Because that's something that we scratch our head on, which is obviously these organizations are sophisticated in how they manage many other risks, right? And then when it comes to cyber, we do see what we look at and describe as this underinsurance problem, and just trying to figure out from an underwriter perspective, what do you think is the origin of that disconnect?
It won't happen to me conundrum. That's typically why, and that's been since the day I started in cyber. That's always been a common refrain, more so with the smaller companies and mid-sized ones than with the large ones. So if we take believe it or not, even some large ones, but that is an anomaly to find a large, sophisticated company that doesn't see any risk with cyber, right? So most of the time that they do. So I'll kind of park them on the side for now. When you get to a mid-sized and a small company, so again, revenue is a bit of a difficult indicator of the actual exposure, and I have an example of that I'll bring up in a little bit. But let's just arbitrarily say a company that's under 500 million in revenue, right? When 500 million in revenue is actually, I'd say, a pretty big company, but still might not be sophisticated as a multi-billion-dollar global organization. Those smaller companies, the typical refrain is, no one's interested in me. Why would they bother stealing from me? Why would they bother attacking me? And the misunderstanding is that the hacker is not looking, they could be, if it's an advanced persistent threat or they want to get after your particular company for some reason, whatever it happens to be, you're building homes in some place that the environmental community thinks is a poor place for you to build it, makes you a higher valued attack target or something along those lines. But again, we'll park those on the side. Most, and David and Andrew, you can back me up on this, most of these companies that we come across, when they say, it won't happen to me, why are they interested in me? My response is, they're not really interested in you. They don't even know who you are. They just see you as a number. You're a port. You're a vulnerability. If they find it, they're going to go in. And if they get in, and then they find your balance sheet, or they find your records, or they find out what type of company you are, or they find that you have hundreds of thousands of health records, they're going to start exploiting that. And then you are the target, but they didn't start going after you. They just went after, they prayed and sprayed. They decided to go out, try to ping open ports. They found a couple, those allowed them in, and hence your target. But that is a very difficult message, apparently, because we've been trying this as an industry for a long time. In the industry, I mean the carriers, but also brokers. A lot of the brokers, the sophisticated cyber brokers, for a long time have been talking about this with their clients, saying that the hackers don't necessarily go after you. They're just trying to get in anywhere. But once they're in, they're burrowed in, and that's when it's too late. Like David said, you can't go to your insurer after and say, hey, I'd love to buy insurance because I just got hacked. Believe it or not, it happens on occasion, but it's rare. That's when we say, thanks, but no thanks. You'll have to clean up this mess first, but that's just not how it works. You can't get health insurance after you've broken your leg. You'd actually need to have it first, right? So that Andrew, that's the main issue that we see, and it goes back to just probably a lack of understanding of why you're a target, and dropping that you're not necessarily a target. Actually, everybody is. Anyone that has IP addresses publicly facing, you're a target. You can get hit. It's not if, typically it's when.
Yeah, so it's really what you're saying, John, it's not just a if and when discussion. It's a if, when, but not me issue that we're dealing with. People, I mean, I always look at it like, I saw a post a few days ago of a guy who said, my car got broken into, and he said, these guys just walk down the street and they open up doors. You know, doors locked, they walk to the next one, they walk to the next one. It's not that they're targeting the individual. And it made a lot of it, just the parallels to, I think, the way that organizations should view this is there are a bunch of criminals checking doors, and they're going to neighborhoods where they think there's going to be valuables in the car, right? But it's so, you know, so if you're a hospital, they know you have health records, they're going to check and see if the doors are open. In this case, the guy didn't, you know, he had automated windows and they hadn't closed. So the guy knew exactly this is the door that's open. And that's exactly what you're talking about. So it's not a personal thing, it's an opportunistic thing.
It's exactly. That's a good opportunistic. It's purely opportunistic most of the time, and in these smaller companies, just think again. The most common response is no one's interested in me.
Yeah,
and that's
But they're interested in your data or your IP. That's for sure.
Yeah, and if that's your source of comfort, you know, no one's interested in me. That's a pretty thing. Like, and you wouldn't really manage any other part of the business in that way, right? Like the warehouse fire insurance is of course our classic example on the P&C side of things. But you know that it doesn't matter that nobody's interested. I mean, a truck could spin out of control, crashes into your warehouse, a fire starts, and you know, so that's little comfort. And similar things can happen in cyber. There is a significant not insignificant, I guess is maybe the right phrase, proportion of cybersecurity losses that are in fact by accident. An employee exposed some records, emails were sent out, et cetera. And you know, that's still a loss. So, I mean, in any business that is at all, you know, active with its own data, there are any number of sources for losses. And so understanding what that exposure is, we believe is kind of the fundamental starting point, because what I'm willing to do about it, insurance and remediation, is it needs to be, if we're all being rational and sound fiduciary managers, is it has to be in proportion to the loss exposure that's out there. And then you go into organizations and very, very few of them actually know what their loss exposure is.
Right. It's an exercise they've never been tasked with. Again, your point before about companies that are taking inventory, they understand the value of their property. There's a total insured value. There's an overall value. They're willing to accept some of that cost on their own balance sheet, but they want to insure the rest for the unknown, obviously the fire, the weather event, anything along those lines. But again, that's something you can hold in your hand in a way or touch, where this is very difficult. And then there are some very, you know, again, sophisticated companies, large and small, that do recognize that there is intrinsic value with their intangible assets, whatever those happen to be. And the more broadly thinking, there's obviously bits and bytes, there's data, there's records, but there's revenue, there's your net income that is affected by a business income loss of some reason due to a network interruption. There's actual hard asset damage. A server or servers or any piece of hardware can be bricked, making it useless. That costs you something too. That was intangible at first, but they fried everything. Therefore, you get the blue screen of death and your computer's useless. That costs money. All these things can end up adding up, obviously, but to get an initial idea of what your intangible assets or data are valued at is difficult. It's something that we you know, for the record, we work very closely with Arx Nimbus on doing exactly that, providing us as the carrier and also eventually our clients or our insureds a better idea about what their intangible assets or digital assets are valued at. And that's a starting point. Right? It doesn't necessarily, you can get disagreement, but it's a starting point. It's better than I don't know.
Right.
That's never a great start. It's like, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. That's a good start as long as you recognize the next step is I need to find out what those assets are worth.
Yeah, and you know, we've been in, I guess, just kind of anecdotally, we've probably been in well, companies large and small. We're actually, one of our customers right now is a law firm that has about 6 attorneys. And we've worked with small credit unions and others. all the way up to around 200 billion in revenue. And through that entire spectrum, one experience stands out that's fairly consistent. And you want this one not to be consistent, but sure enough, it is. And we've probably been in about, I don't know, 80 of the Fortune 500 companies in the last year or so and presented to them. And one of the things we like to do is to say, well, what are you doing right now around cyber risk management? And the common answer that you hear is, well, we've got a risk register. We have an annual, a big consulting firm comes in, they go through the place top to bottom, they do a risk analysis and risk assessment, usually is the term. And then the other thing that we do is we do pen tests. So you have those three, which granted, now at one point, and you almost have to go all the way back to the 90s, where that constituted a comprehensive risk management program. But at one point it did. We get that. But this is the world of 2024, and things have moved forward at a very accelerating clip here in terms of the sophistication of these attacks, the level of exposure, regulatory landscape has completely changed. These three kind of rudimentary approaches to the problem are not sufficient. I mean, it's just, and so one thing we do, and it's almost kind of embarrassing for our profession in cybersecurity that it's this way, is we tend to ask, great, so you're doing these risk management things, and you've got to believe that, and it usually turns out someone somewhere in the organization is checking off a compliance checklist. Are we doing risk management? Yes. Okay, done. And then they're just like moving on, which is the sad state of affairs. But then you say, well, you're doing these things. You've got kind of, let's call it legacy risk management in place. That sounds like a fairly ambitious effort. And so, by the way, the results of those efforts, what is your cyber risk? And you can hear a pin drop in the room. And they don't know. And again, if it's property and casualty, they'll know the replacement value of that warehouse and the cost of the contents and so on. And it appears on a line item. And further to your point, John, I mean, these things, they don't appear on a line item. And it's almost like the GAAP accounting treatment of this has to catch up. Yeah. But because of that, it gets less attention. And that really is the starting point, is to simply let me just at least understand what my loss exposure is as a starting point. Even if it's in a wide range, at least I have some understanding. And this is very worrisome when you actually look at some of these cases like Equifax, where you had a $1.4 billion loss and they had 40 million in cyber insurance. That's 2.8%. I mean, and somebody over there thought that was the right number.
Yeah, I guess back to the point here, that's a good segue into the underinsured question. And there's underinsured in the very small company space, and I've got some opinions or ideas around why that's happening in the mid and the large market space. And we can start with the large companies. They're sophisticated buyers of insurance, so that risk management program is contemplating everything from property insurance and casualty and employment practices and professional services and directors and officers, and cyber's one of them. And far too often, cyber's one that gets spoken about last, handled last. And the reason and I don't know the answer to this, the reason they may have only bought $40 million would be the budget simply didn't support to buy any more. That's all there was to it, and they just didn't purchase it. There could have been an internal decision. Oftentimes, that internal decision would be influenced by somebody in the security area saying, the money you would have spent on an additional 100 million is better served with me, and I can buy the next greatest app to secure. And there is that isn't unnecessarily like untrue, but there's a point of diminishing return with buying the latest and greatest security tool. And there's also the concept of security tools and insurance working together as opposed to being against each other, saying, well, I need the dollar and you don't need it. It should be, you can treat risk up to a certain point. At that point, you then accept some of the risk, but also you transfer some. And if you're constantly struggling between how much do I transfer versus how much do I actually try to protect, and you spend too much on one or the other, because you can actually buy too much insurance, right? It's rare, but you can. But more often in cyber, you're trading the dollar of insurance for either a different insurance program, whatever it happens to be. It could be a massive property exposure, who knows? But more likely, you're trading that cybersecurity insurance dollar for cybersecurity tools. And no matter how well you patch your roof, eventually it's going to leak.
Yeah.
And there's no matter what you do, it's going to leak, right? So you have to prepare for that. And guess what? If it leaks and causes water damage, you probably can treat that with insurance, right? And,
Yeah,
and
John,
so that's the back and forth that you end up with. Yeah, that's more the
you hit on
physical corollary.
you hit on a great point there, which is this discussion, right? The ability for folks to actually have a trade-off discussion within an organization. And often, right, these are looked as either or, right? When we look at a comprehensive cyber security program, right, risk transfer is a key component of that. It's one of the legs of the chair, so to speak. And just to kind of use a real world example, and it's why we think that when you quantify that risk, you're able to break down those silos and you're able to have those trade-off discussions. And usually we need all of the above. We need more money for the tools and solutions. We need more money for for a cyber policy in order to be protected, right, in an overall way. And so, one of our clients recently had a very low insurance policy. But when they looked and they were able to take to the board, hey, look, this is how much exposure we actually have, our true actual cyber exposure. Here's how much we've remediated. Here's how much that remains. What are we going to do with this kind of net risk exposure? And immediately they said, we'll double our insurance policy. And over the next 4 years, we're going to double it again, right? So we're able now to plan. We're able to plan strategically. And it's kind of that marrying between the tactical and the strategic that we like to see happen with an organization.
Yeah.
But they started to look at it, and so now you have the CISO, you have the head of risk management. They're all coordinating, going, okay, how do we get this? How do we go to the board and articulate the position that we're in with new signals, new information that we've been provided that we didn't have before? And to me, you start to see a lot of kind of synergy there. And as opposed to what some people think is, if I give that away, I'm not going to get. What you often will see is, well, we're going to give you more because now we know what you're doing, and we're also going to increase our risk transfer. So we've seen that in real world. It seems almost counterintuitive to, I'm sure, many people on the call. But once you're able to accurately portray the risk facing the organization, and I think it's key that it's in financial terms, these discussions and these decisions start to become more tangible, to use your analogy earlier, where you can touch and feel and see this risk exists, and here's what it's costing the organization.
Yeah, so the level of coverage is at some level related to the perceived loss exposure in the organization. And just if it's any guide, our direct experience working with companies is that it's just all over the map. And we have had, more often than not, meetings where if you have the head of cybersecurity, the CISO, in the room, and maybe you've got the CIO, maybe the CFO, head of legal, maybe head of risk management, maybe internal audit in the room. When you have those disciplines represented, there is no consensus. You can just expect there will be no consensus around either the maturity of their current cyber protections, including cyber insurance, or in conjunction with that, the level of exposure that they feel they have. And emphasis on the word feel, because it really is down to a feeling as opposed to any kind of proper analysis or hard numbers. And one of the places that shows up first and foremost is just in there, and you kind of alluded to this, John, with the example of a small company could have a large number of records. Their exposure in terms of notification costs. And it's a pretty simple thing, right? I mean, we had those who have been in cyber for a while recognize this, of course, but we had a law passed in the Massachusetts legislature probably over 10 years ago now, that you had to notify everybody in the data set if one person was compromised. And that, of course, rippled through to the other states, and now we're kind of all under that regimen. But companies have not done the effort to even take, how many records do I have? What's the cost of a postage stamp, folks? And multiply it and come up with that. We worked with a $170 billion biopharma who believed that their PII breach risk was around 25 million. We're able to show them just the notification costs alone would have been over 60 million. And so that's kind of the basics, but then you go from there to not just the impact, but what's the probability of that against actual losses that have occurred over time. What are the factors in terms of your industry that should be understood within this, and now what's the status of your controls, and what does that leave you open to according to standards like NIST, for example, which are some of the best we've got. And so getting that understanding, we've found situations more often than not where somebody like the CFO will say, well, I think we're on a maturity scale of like a 1 to 5. I think we're about a 2.4. And the CISO says, well, no, we're about a 4.2, actually. We're not perfect, but we're getting better, et cetera. You cannot have a conversation in that kind of management team about where do we need to be, how long are we willing to take to get there, and what are we willing to spend to get there. And even if they're big believers in remediation, the road to a better point on remediation should be including covering the current gap. And one of the most apparent ways to do that without a lot of lag time is a proper insurance policy.
Yeah, to your point of, I have a good example of an underinsured, what I believe. Again, I'm not involved in this. I don't know if there's a claim been made or anything. This is just publicly available information about a relatively small, you'd think, company it's a third-party administrator, a TPA. It recently announced they had a breach of 800,000 records, health records. All right, and that's a good size breach. That's enough that will draw the attention. Never mind notifying, which is required by law. Never mind providing credit monitoring or identity theft monitoring or forensics or all the other stuff, which I'll get into. 800,000 is enough for a plaintiff's attorney to get involved, right? So you definitely increase the risk, the more records and the sensitivity of the records that are actually lost. But this company, I looked them up. They have 7 million in revenue last year, which is a very small company. 7 million is not a big company by any means. And they had 32 employees. Again, a very small company. Their publicly facing IP addresses or their attack surface was relatively small, but they fell prey to a phishing incident, and that allowed a criminal to get in. The records were exposed. Now, this company bought, according to publicly available records, they stated that they were remediating this through a number of channels, and one was tapping into a $1 million insurance policy. Now, a $7 million TPA buying $1 million of cyber insurance may seem like a lot. And at first glance, I would think they're probably sufficiently insured until you dig in a little further and find out that they have at least 800,000 records. That's at least. That doesn't mean the entire database has been touched. They might have 1, 2, 3 million records. So the size of the company from a revenue and an employee count standpoint doesn't necessarily mean they're not much of a risk if they're little. This is clear that a company like this with 800,000 records compromised now has to notify the individuals of that compromise. They don't have to provide credit monitoring, but they probably should. That avoids any sort of lawsuit coming against them saying you didn't let these people know in time, you didn't provide them proper services, etc. There's always public relations issues. They could lose clients because of this. There are clearly issues with forensics. How did this happen? How do I stop this from happening again? These, by the way, are all things that I don't know if this insurance policy for this company would cover these things, but your typical robust insurance policy, a standalone cyber insurance policy, would cover the notification costs, the credit monitoring costs. It would provide services for forensics It would provide legal services. There are law firms that are highly specialized in just this area, so they know what you need to do in the event something like this were to happen. So, for example, and I don't know the details, I'm just, this is conjecture. If those 800,000 records compromised were all encrypted and no keys were lost, meaning no one can actually see these records or find out what's in them, there's a very good chance you wouldn't have to notify by state laws, because most of the laws are written where if the data is unencrypted, you have to notify, but if it's encrypted, you don't have to. A specialized law firm would be able to tell you that. There's also attorneys general in certain states that are all over this. Maine, New York, Connecticut, they are very interested in this, and they'll always get a letter shot off to these companies from these 6 or so attorneys general, right? You also need law firms to be able to deal with them. So if you deal with them inappropriately by a firm that doesn't know what they're doing, you run the risk of upsetting them, making them, you could just, these are people, you could make them mad, right? And you don't want to upset an attorney general office, because then they'll lop even more on you. So you have regulatory issues to deal with. By the way, those are also included in most standard cyber insurance policies, the regulatory issues. And then I go back to forensics. That's a big part of this. So that company probably should have purchased 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 million of insurance as opposed to 1. But again, at first blush, we probably thought if this company had a board, it's a relatively small company, but the executives probably thought they were completely covered because they had $1 million in insurance, but they didn't get or may not have received. Again, this is me taking a wild guess here. There's a chance they didn't take into account the amount of records and the value of those records, especially on to access brokers, to anyone in ransomware gangs. The value of healthcare records is very high compared to email addresses and some lower end credentials, which aren't worth as much. So this is a business. These records are worth quite a bit. So again, the cost of this would likely far exceed the $1 million in insurance they have.
Well, that's another very important point here, is how many organizations have really understood the cost of the data that they're sitting on top of and protecting in terms of the dark web. And there's a very brisk market for these records, primarily centered on 3 types: GLBA or banking records, which are kind of in the mid-tier in terms of value, and then PCI records, of course, or credit card records. And those have the value in the dark web; those have gone down over time, and are the least valuable of them. But HIPAA records still are maintaining their value, and they're the most lucrative, most attractive of these, which is probably bleeding a little bit over into why we see such a frequency in ransomware in the healthcare space. But understanding those dynamics is hugely important, because look, I'm spending to protect something, and I don't know the value of what I'm protecting to the attackers. That doesn't seem entirely rational.
Yeah, and we talk a lot too about the value of intangible assets or data, but let's not forget about just good plain revenue loss or net income loss. So business or network interruption is also an important component of cyber coverages, and that area I would say is chronically underinsured or not insured at all, especially with smaller companies. So let's just take the prior example I talked about. Let's say the small company actually didn't have this many records. It only had 5,000 records, nothing to really worry about. They may think, all right, I'm perfectly fine, I'm insured. I need to buy this very basic stripped down cyber insurance that doesn't cover net income or business income loss due to a network event, and it doesn't cover ransomware. You see this a lot with smaller companies that buy a package policy that covers, they call them BOPs, business owner policy, which is a small policy that covers a number of different things for a small company. And oftentimes the sellers of these policies, the carriers, will include, quote unquote, I'll call it cyber light. And that would be a very low sublimit for, in the event you had a breach, you may get access to a law firm, and we might notify folks or something along those lines. Sometimes it's even third party only, what's meaning someone has to make a claim against you for the loss of that data, but all of the other associated costs with that data aren't covered in this little sublimit. And another thing that is rarely covered in that sublimit would be business income loss. So as an example, there's a chance that this company that had this breach had to shut their network down for a while to figure out what was wrong. It's like if there's a leak in your house in a pipe, you shut the water off, right? You don't have water for a while. So what happens to companies that suffer a ransomware event and are being extorted for a payment? They oftentimes stop doing business until this can get taken care of. Sometimes they stop voluntarily. Other times they can't because they're locked out of their systems. They can't actually operate. Each day they're down is income loss. So this small company with 7 million in revenue, if they were shut down for, let's just say it's a real bad situation and they were shut down for 6 days straight or something along those lines, and they weren't able to process claims for 6 days and they weren't able to get up and running for 6 days, and then they had a net income loss, that could very well shut that company down. They go out of business. And years ago, I think it was the Business Interruption Institute, believe it or not, that exists. There's an institute called that. They estimated that roughly 50% of companies that suffer a business income loss and network interruption within 12 months go out of business. Yeah. They can never recover, right? Change Healthcare did that to a lot of small doctors' offices who couldn't process payments. That was a secondary or a knock-on effect of this. That's also a risk that they probably never contemplated, in that Change Healthcare wasn't able to process payments. Therefore, the small doctor's office that doesn't keep millions of dollars of cash on their balance sheet can't process payments or can't process them in time, and therefore they have to shut down. Right? That's awful. Right? As the son of a small business owner, right? And my dad ran his own auto body shop. If he shut down for a week and couldn't do anything, he might go out of business. Right. So if you're underinsured, meaning you just have $10,000 assigned to your third-party cyber liability, and you experience a significant ransomware event that shuts you down, and by the way, they ask for payment, which for an average small company is, I believe, the latest study I read from Net Diligence, who puts out great information about this sort of thing from actual claims, was $568,000 was the average ransomware payment. Right? That's a lot of money for a small company to have to pay out. A lot. Huge. So the underinsured would have never touched on something like that. And again, this could happen to a company that doesn't have much data, doesn't have anything of any value, but they got ransomed. And the ransomware, the extortion folks, and you speak to people who deal with them, they're awful people. They're not good people. They don't care, and they want to get paid. So that's something that all small business owners and medium-sized need to take that into account. Is the value of your company is not necessarily always associated with the intangible assets. It's also associated with, can you keep your doors open and continue to do business, because that's how you get revenue. And if you can't, how long can you go for? Most small companies cannot go for a long time at all. Restaurants probably couldn't even go for more than a couple of days. They operate in such thin margins, they may end up going out of business.
Yeah, no, easily. And we saw this with, you mentioned Change Healthcare. One of the outcomes there was that in their gap period where they had literally an outage of their core systems. And so they weren't able to process the transactions that they're there for. And there was a competitor that came in. This really didn't get probably as much press coverage as it should have, but a competitor came in that was a very small fry and compared to Change Healthcare prior to the incident. And that competitor was able to step up in that gap period, get physicians' offices and others to sign on to their services instead, and triple their revenues, triple their own revenues. And they reached 5 billion in transaction value processed within just a matter of like 6 weeks during that outage, which was an extended outage, which is why the losses mounted so high. Now, if a competitor comes in and they start kind of carving up your business and people become loyal to them, who at that point have disenfranchised because of inavailability of services. That at that point, that's tough to make back. I mean, that to me puts a graph in my mind of kind of a falling off the cliff effect when revenues stop, and then to build those back is a long, shallow road back.
Mm-hmm.
And so the costs of those things are just completely underestimated in today's world by so many organizations.
100%. Yep. Yeah, and it highlights the human element that we kind of hit on at the very beginning, right? I mean, it's not just a financial loss. There is a huge human implication. That's why I'm a big proponent of commercial risk transfer, right? I mean, that is the oh gosh, it happened moment. And
Yeah.
it's not only the services people like Falcon provide to help people get back on their feet, but it's that assurance that, hey, we can still, as we sort out, and I've talked to many people who are in the midst of an attack, and it's terrifying. They weren't prepared. To your point, John, they never thought it was going to happen to them, but now they're in the thick of it. And as we always talk about, get right of boom, left of boom, right? I mean, let's get you prepared today, so you're not having to rush and make a lot of those decisions after you've already been attacked. And it's the same kind of thing with insurance. They're going to wish they had more insurance, maybe, right? In that example that you mentioned with the smaller company with 800K, and the amount of investment that they're putting into it, whether that's into their remediation efforts or into the risk transfer, right? Both of those look small compared to the pain and suffering caused and the agony of trying to rebuild and restore in the light of an event. So it's again, I do think, to David's point earlier, it really starts with that first moment where you can say, what are we actually trying to manage? And if you're starting with a gut opinion, again, to your point, John, too, that's a bad place to start thinking about what you're trying to manage effectively, and make the necessary decisions that are risk informed as opposed to maybe opinion driven.
Yeah. And the underinsured component too comes into play is oftentimes we think about this, and some like large companies, very sophisticated ones, are buying insurance, and it's pretty much a transactional event, dollar for dollar. I'm going to tap into this insurance for the dollars. I can do with it what I'm sophisticated enough to handle this issue, but I do need to transfer some of this risk so I can get paid for that, right? That's larger, more sophisticated companies can go ahead and do that. But most companies, again, are not large and sophisticated. Most are middle-sized or small-sized companies that are just trying to grow or keep things going. And to think about the cost of insurance and I'm getting X amount of dollars paid out to me is a very narrow way to look at it. So years ago it was cyber liability, which I don't even like the word cyber, quite frankly. I prefer it more like operational liability or something along those lines, because that's really what it is not even liability. It's an operational exposure that you treat with cyber insurance services. And the services component is very important. It's not just we write you a check and you handle everything. The more sophisticated cyber carriers and brokers will offer products that have a huge service component built into them. In the event something happens, in a ransomware event, which is the most common thing. I bring up ransomware a lot because even though ransomware has decreased a bit in the severity of the issues that have been going on, the frequency of these events continues to outpace losses in cyber for any other type of exposure. It outpaces business email compromise. It outpaces good old-fashioned data breaches. Roughly 1 in 4 claims are due to a ransomware event. All the rest combined don't even come close to that. So it's 1 out of 4 times it's a ransomware event. In the event something were to happen, say ransomware or a fat finger mistake that shuts your network down or anything that disrupts your business, a cyber insurance policy and the services component are intended to get things going immediately. So you make the call, right? You break the window, you pick up the bat phone or the glass, you call, and legal advice comes in right away. And this is within, oftentimes, for instance, with Falcon, you call a hotline. Once that hotline is picked up, within 15 minutes, someone's called you back to assess what's going on. Because oftentimes when we get calls for a breach or any sort of event, it's ongoing. It's happening, right? Now, again, different from my house burnt down, God forbid. The insurance company comes in with an adjuster after everything's taken care of. They don't show up with the fire truck, right? In this case, think of cyber insurance as the fire truck. We show up with folks we work with ARC Nimbus, with other companies we work with, and they do everything from provide legal advice, get forensics involved, sometimes remotely, sometimes on site, to stop the leak of the dam before things get too bad, and then bring you through the entire process much more quickly than you would if you tried to do it on your own. Much less expensive, I might add, because if you go to market and ask for notification from the open market and credit monitoring from the open market and forensics from the open market, you get sticker price. If you do it through insurance, we've already negotiated deals with these panel folks that we have that we work very closely with, and you get it for less money, a lot less money. And they do these things. This is all they do. So they do it over and over and over again. So the idea is that if an event were to occur, we can hopefully get you up and running much more quickly than if you tried to do it on your own. Sadly, most companies, and if you're underinsured, you don't have access to any of these things. You are making a call later on to try to collect a $10,000 check, but it takes a long time sometimes to do that. That's not the case when you buy a standalone cyber insurance policy or services that will start the instant you make that phone call and fix these issues, hopefully much more quickly than you would if you had to do it on your own.
Absolutely. And we're very proud to be part of that stack with Falcon on those remediation efforts post breach as well. And that's hugely important. And you may have very sophisticated solutions in place, but those are not going to provide those kinds of services to get you over this air gap, if you want to use that phrase, in the event of a loss. And I guess it kind of goes to there's a little bit of a fallacy that I think we all run into in this market, and that is the organization that believes they can remediate their way out of risk entirely. And we talk with people at CISA and DHS all the time. They firmly believe, they're not entirely sure how to engage this yet, but they firmly believe that insurance is an absolutely essential element in getting the country, our society, and business at large to a better place in cyber, that it can't be just through remediation. But still, there are organizations who have this belief somehow that I can remediate my way out of risk. And no one's ever done it. They've never been able to get to 100%. And the cost of doing that through these ever more sophisticated solutions just kind of hockey sticks up at some level. Mm-hmm. And that's really where you need to have insurance. And we're not saying this as promotional or anything else, but like mathematically, we can prove out that you need insurance as a key component of your risk avoidance, your risk management, et cetera. And that is something. The threats out there are mounting. We all need to get much more sophisticated on this front.
Yeah, absolutely agree. It's
hey John, I know we got about 6 minutes left or 7 minutes left. I would love to get, I'm sure those listening would also love to hear from an underwriter perspective. David just hit on this. It's mounting and evolving risks, right? And we know they're coming, right? And we know technology is playing a huge part in that. And there's two new spaces we'd love to get one particularly, I guess, to get your thoughts on, which is AI, right? So we're seeing billions and billions of dollars being spent by collectively in the market, but individually hundreds of millions of dollars, even at company level, to build an AI into their system. So we've talked on previous webcasts about the threat of AI from a cybersecurity perspective, its benefits and threat hunting, detection, et cetera. But from an insurance perspective, how are the underwriters looking at AI? Because you do have that kind of two sides. One is you're bringing in the AI into the organization, you're building out capabilities that you're hoping are going to lead to significant revenue growth and productivity. The attackers are also using it as well. So that there's kind of this double-sided sword. But with rapid adoption of AI, how's Falcon looking at it? What are your thoughts on it? Love to know.
we're trying to learn as much as we can about, so there's a couple of strings there. One would be a company's internal use of AI, right? Building their own narrow or weak AI to do something, whatever it happens to be, a legal profession, construction, it's everywhere. And the funny thing is, it's been around for 10, 15 years, right? When you get a book recommendation from Amazon, that's AI. But now it's expounded to a point where we do want to know, or we're exploring what companies are, what's their strategy, what are they doing, how are they going to deploy this, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, they could barrel into AI, not realize what it is they're doing in some sense for whatever reason. It could be the marketing group, and they expose themselves. So the law firms are a prime example. There are a few cases already where law firms have relied on AI to, say, write a brief, and there were cases in that brief that were referred to that never existed. The AI attributed the case law to judges who did exist, but the cases never existed. The AI literally made it up, right? That's an exposure right for the law firm. That's not necessarily a cyber exposure. That's more of a professional liability exposure, I should say. It directly is an E&O, a professional liability exposure. So if you're writing lines in that space, you'd want to look into that. That's also in medical practices. I don't think I'd want AI giving me treatment for my whatever it happens to be. If I have some sort of disease, I don't want AI to. I'd rather have a doctor doing that at first, right? So there's exposure there. So we look into that, and that's broadly across a number of different areas. From a cybersecurity standpoint, AI right now, and I guess the best way I can describe how we look at it is if there's a criminal out there that has the keys to a home, AI now allows them to have 1,000 keys to 1,000 homes and open all those doors all at the same time. And they can just compound, right? So there's that. And criminals they run businesses and they're smart people. And they are going to find out all the ways they can use AI first. Well before companies figure out legitimate ways to use it, the criminals have already figured out ways to do it. And we've seen it with deep fakes and voice. It's already out there. So it's just a matter of, some of the risk assessment we'll do on companies will be the same, right? So if you still are buttoned up from a security standpoint, AI is going to make it a bit more difficult to defend, but at least you're buttoned up. At least you're still aware of what your exposure are, aware of what the risks are. Is there an additional level of training for phishing? Are there controls in place when phone calls come in that could be a deep fake? It could be the CEO's voice, but it isn't. And we've all seen this. And personally, we've all seen an increase, I think, in the amount of bogus texts we receive that look really good these days, emails. That's all AI. So it's compounding an issue that's already existing. And Andrew, to be honest, it's scary. AI it's to be used for these purposes is something that could keep. If I'm a CISO, it definitely keeps me up at night. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. We heard a great guy recently, or partners who said, you need to think about the hacker not just as the guy in the hoodie in the basement, but realize that's the guy usually working for the mastermind who's a PhD, right? Highly educated, highly skilled, who's been working with AI for 15, 20 years, right? And he is taking advantage. I mean, these guys are mathematics, PhDs, right? I mean, computer science PhDs. And there's the hoodie guys too, but these guys are sophisticated players who are developing the tools that are going to be attacking you. Sorry, David.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Andrew. And it's exacerbated by the fact that there are billions of dollars now being invested, and that is something that is a new trend that has ratcheted up in the last 18 months. Major initiatives. Morgan Stanley just did an analysis on many of them across 400 companies going into AI, and yet most of these AI initiatives are not properly secured. They were started by the marketing department or by operations, somebody else. Maybe they started off as kind of a science experiment internally, and they've grown, and now there's customer data out there and so on. And yet, the amount that has been allocated to secure these initiatives has been really close to zero. Mm-hmm. And this is something that's going to come back to bite us, because there is such a thing as model poisoning and corrupting essentially your AI functions. And once they become an endemic part of the operation, that is business interruption, as you said earlier, John.
Yeah, it's very high on the list. I'd say it's number one on the list of things that we are looking at in trying to assess how do we underwrite to this, how do we inform our insureds the best practices, all of that. It's top of list.
Absolutely.
So I know we're at our time now, and just to kind of close things out, maybe summarize, what can you do now? And that is obviously get current risk management in place. Don't rely on these legacy methods and so on. That's really not sufficient for the world of today. And then quantify your overall risk exposure. That's the important starting point. Work with your broker or agent on what a proper insurance program is going to be in the cyberspace. And then, ideally, many brokers, many more, are now becoming very cyber aware.
Right.
And they can lead you through that process, but you really do need to make an effort to understand what your actual risk exposure is so that you can calibrate to optimum levels.
Right. All right. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for your time. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you much. Bye now.